Can't hear you, Rabbi.
Okay, a good vach. Tonight is the anniversary of the passing of my great-grandfather, Rabbi Moshe Levin. I want to share with you a story about him, as well as a story of the Rebbe Marash. I felt that I didn't really do justice. The story last week was too short. So I want to share with you an incredible story about my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and as well about the Rebbe Marash, on the same theme, which is very connected to the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov revealed how every neshama always stays connected to God no matter what's going on. And my great-grandfather, Rabbi Moshe Levin, when he was a young boy, he joined the yeshiva in Lubavitch in Russia, the Rebbe's yeshiva, the previous Rebbe's yeshiva. And the previous Rebbe was the menahel, he was the dean of the yeshiva. And my great-grandfather was a bit of a mischievous child. And very often he would do all kinds of tricks. And one of the things he liked to do was to feed goats vodka. That's his thing. So one day he got a goat drunk, and he wasn't satisfied with getting the goat just drunk. He also wanted the goat to do something more entertaining. So he took the goat and he brought the goat into the synagogue where all the students, hundreds of students in the yeshiva would study. No one was there when he arrived with the goat. And he brought the goat into a little closet where they kept the chumashim. And the goat is there in the little closet, and then the studies shortly begin afterwards. And throughout this time of study, people hear this bleating of a goat. No one knows exactly where it's coming from. And then that day was a Monday or a Thursday. And when it came a time for the Torah to be taken out to be read, so they opened up this closet so everyone can get a chumash to follow along with the reading. So they open up the closet, and out comes the goat, the drunken goat. And the goat starts prancing around the synagogue. And Rabbi Moshe Levin thought this was incredibly funny, and he was laughing. And I'm not sure if it was with divine inspiration or just because he was laughing too much. The previous Rebbe summoned him and said to him, he realized he was the culprit, and he said to him, "You're no longer welcome in the yeshiva." So he responded to the Rebbe and he said, "Sending me out of the yeshiva is one thing, but if you're sending me out of the yeshiva, I want you to know you're also sending away my children, my grandchildren, and my great-grandchildren." That's what he told the previous Rebbe. And the previous Rebbe apparently saw in him that he was, although he was a bit of a mischievous guy, he had something inside that was, and sure enough, he let him back in the yeshiva. And that yeshiva, his children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, now his great-great-grandchildren study in that same yeshiva, the yeshiva Timchet Tmimim of the Lubavitch yeshiva. So this remark that he told the previous Rebbe is very connected with the theme of the story I want to share with you about the Rebbe Marash. A lot of people today feel a little bit of hypocritical about doing more mitzvahs and learning more Torah than usual. It feels hypocritical because you learn Torah, you do mitzvahs, but why should I do more now? I mean, does this really fit who I am and what I'm about? And it doesn't seem like it's me just because the world is changing. Does that mean I have to change? And am I ready for it? And all kinds of Jewish guilt kind of questions. When I was a chaplain in various federal facilities, federal prisons, so there was a lot of Jews always felt like, am I allowed to put on tefillin? Am I allowed to keep Shabbat? Am I allowed to keep kosher, knowing who I am? And the truth is that the Rabbi Marash said, which is the theme of the story I'm about to share with you, Rabbi Moshe said, when you throw a stick into the air, it falls on the side of its root. That's what the Talmud says that. I'm not sure what the physical phenomena that the Talmud is referring to means, but it's clear that when you get thrown in the air, you always gravitate to your roots. Things happen in everyone's life, all kinds of changes happen. And when you get thrown in the air, you have to know that what happens naturally is you're going to go towards your roots. You're going to connect to your roots. That's what happens when you get thrown in the air. That's what happens. So in a similar way, I'm going to share with you a story of the previous Rebbe and the Rebbe Marash and the Rebbe Rashab. It's an incredible story. I can't share with you the entire story. It's a very long story. I wish I could whet your appetite enough to read the story in the original. It's translated, it's online. If you ask me for a link, I'll be happy to send you a link. It's an incredible, incredible story. But I want to share with you at least a part of the story, as is customary in Motzei Shabbos, to share a story of tzaddikim. The previous Rebbe, the time the story took place, was an activist working on behalf of his father to help the Jewish people in various ways. Jewish people at the time were suffering from all kinds of decrees of the government against them, and that their own internal challenges. And to this end, the previous Rebbe was traveling from Paris to Petersburg. It was a long trip from Paris to Petersburg, and the trip left on the 9th of Shvat, on a Motzei Shabbos, and the previous Rebbe left at 11:30 p.m. And throughout this entire journey, the previous Rebbe says every single detail to the time, exactly the place, with incredible detail. And when you hear all the details, you get the full impact of the story, which is why I want you to read it. So the Frierdiker Rebbe says he leaves at 11:30 from Paris, and the train passes through various stops. It was an express train, but it did stop in many places. And usually the train stopped for 15 minutes, like when the train stopped in Monte Carlo, it was for 15 minutes. But in various stops, the train stopped for half an hour. One of the places the train stopped for a longer amount of time was in Menton. Menton at that time was a place he was looking forward to visiting because his father and mother were there on a sort of a health resort many tzaddikim would visit. And the Rebbe Rashab was there with his mother, Rebbe Tzimshter Sarah, and he was going to meet the previous Rebbe at the train station for their half-hour stop. So the previous Rebbe arrives in Menton, and there was large windows in the train station. He could see his father sitting there in the lobby of the train station, and he comes into the lobby and he sees his father. His father greets him with his father's characteristic smile and warmth. And after exchanging pleasantries, they went towards the business that the previous Rebbe was involved in, what had been accomplished in his visit to Paris, and what he intended to accomplish in his subsequent visits to Moscow and St. Petersburg. So the previous Rebbe is discussing with his father. His father gives him various letters to read, to deliver to certain people, and the porter of the train tells the previous Rebbe it's time to go. The previous Rebbe goes back on the train. And as he's going back on the train, his father stands up and raises his hands like the Kohanim do to bless his son. And the previous Rebbe, the train departs. The train departs, and at about 6 p.m., the previous Rebbe went into the dining car of the train. Each room in the train, each person had their own room in the train. The previous Rebbe's room, he said, had a table and a desk and a bed and a washroom, which he and the neighboring car would share. And the previous Rebbe said he had hoped to write something during this journey, but the train went with such speed that it was difficult for him to write. However, he said that certain parts of the journey, which were more scenic, the train went along the coast, and since it was so beautiful, the train deliberately went a little slower so people could absorb the beautiful scenery. The previous Rebbe said it would be worth it to write the details of the beautiful scenic view of the coast that he was privy to, and it's just he didn't have time to write about that. Instead, he only wants to share in his diary a certain event that happened to a chassid who he describes as Mr. YM. Apparently, he doesn't want to say the name of this chassid because he doesn't want to embarrass him. Anyway, so the previous Rebbe says that this at 6 p.m. he goes into the dining car and he has some tea. As he's sitting there with the tea, there's another man there, older man, who in his 50s, who is drinking wine, non-kosher wine, of course, and eating non-kosher meat. And he sees the previous Rebbe, and he gets up and walks over to the previous Rebbe, and he says to the previous Rebbe, "Are you perhaps a son or a grandson of the Rebbe Maharaj?" By the way, the Rebbe often said a story about someone who had seen the Rebbe Maharaj, seen the Friedrich Rebbe, and had thought that Friedrich Rebbe was the Rebbe Maharaj who had come back to life. And I'm not sure if the Rebbe is referring to this story or not, but every time the Rebbe said the story, interestingly, every single time you can see on video, he cries as he says a story somehow about the connection between the previous Rebbe and the Rebbe Maharaj, how their faces were similar. Some of that always evoked the Rebbe to start crying. Either way, so this man walks over to the previous Rebbe and he asks the previous Rebbe, "Are you perhaps a son or grandson of the Rebbe Maharaj?" Previous Rebbe says, "Indeed, I am a grandson of the Rebbe Maharaj." The man doesn't respond. His face turns red and he starts to cry. Previous Rebbe returns to his car, to his room in the train. The train stops shortly afterwards in Frankfurt. The previous Rebbe gets off the train to breathe, just to get fresh air. The man goes off the train as well, and he tells the previous Rebbe he wants to share with him a story, but he's so emotional he can't continue. They go back on the train. The train arrives in Berlin. The previous Rebbe then goes out a train as well. It was too early to pray, so he couldn't pray. It was morning, early, but it was before daybreak. And the previous Rebbe goes off the train. Again, the man comes over to the previous Rebbe. He complains, "I couldn't sleep all night." And he wants to talk to the previous Rebbe, but he's so emotional he can't say anything. The previous Rebbe returns back into the train. He goes back inside his compartment to his room in the train, and he begins to daven. He's davening, and the porter comes to the room and knocks on the door of the previous Rebbe and says, "Someone wants to see you." Previous Rebbe was still in the middle of praying. He says he can come back in a half an hour. In a half hour comes, the man comes in, the same man, and he comes into the room of the previous Rebbe, and he's so emotional that he can't talk, and he just starts to cry. And he's crying. The previous Rebbe describes how his crying. He said the man, he's in his 50s, older man. He said he never saw anything like this. The man was dressed like an aristocrat. He had his mustache twirled up, like the aristocrats. He was dressed in a very aristocratic way. And the man was crying so deeply and bitterly that his whole body was shaking. And the previous Rebbe at first thought that the man had gone insane. And he didn't know what to do. Should he try to comfort him? Should he leave him alone? And eventually, the previous Rebbe saw he wasn't stopping to cry. He started to comfort him. And the man asked the previous Rebbe, "Can you do a spiritual favor for me? Can I borrow your tefillin?" The previous Rebbe was surprised by the request, gave him his tefillin, and he left him alone so he could pray by himself. He prayed for some time, a long time, crying and crying, and the previous Rebbe left him alone to pray, and he came back, and the man was still too emotional to talk to the Rebbe, and he asked the previous Rebbe if he could borrow a siddur. Apparently, the previous Rebbe thought he wants to say Tehillim, he wants to daven mincha, and he lent him the siddur. About 3 o'clock, the porter comes to the room again in the previous Rebbe, and he says the man wants to speak to you. And he comes back into the room, and he says to the previous Rebbe who he was and his life story. There was a chassid of the Mittler Rebbe, whose name was Shlomo. Shlomo was a businessman who was into diamonds. He used to travel often to various places to purchase and to sell diamonds. And he had a whole dynasty of, the Mittler Rebbe had blessed him, many blessings. He blessed him with wealth. He blessed him with long life. and he blessed him with children. He had a lot of children, and he was very wealthy, and his children grew, and they had children, and there was a chassid of the Reb Marash, whose name was Reb Leib, and Reb Leib, the grandson of Reb Shlomo, who was the father of this man who was in the room with the previous Rebbe, Mr. Y.M. The chassid Reb Leib, the chassid Reb Marash, a very devoted chassid, and for business reasons, he had to move to Petersburg. He was a diamond merchant, and it was better for his business to move to Petersburg. And although Petersburg was a far cry from the Hasidic city of S, the previous Rebbe was very careful not to say any identifying details of Mr. Y.M. They were living in a city called S, and then they moved to Petersburg, and the chassid, although he moved to this more of a strange culture compared to where he was before, he still maintained very deeply his Hasidic values, and he tried to keep his children also involved in those same values. However, Mr. Y.M. at the time was 15 years old. He wasn't that interested, although his father still would invite his friends. They would have farbrengens, they would have Hasidic gatherings in the home, and there was a very religious atmosphere. But he was more influenced by his neighbors, and he wasn't really interested in hanging around with his father and his father's friends. And he had his own friends, and he little by little drifted from the values of his parents. And although he's a little young boy, 15 years old, he lived at home. And his father and his family, they left to their summer home. And when they went to the summer home, it was shortly before Rosh Hashanah. His father, Reb Leib, told his son, I want to go visit the Reb Marash for Rosh Hashanah. I want you to come with me. The son agreed. It wasn't the top thing he wanted to do. I mean, at this time in his life, he was already going with his friends to all of these parties, and he was associating with them, but he went with his father. And he told the previous Rebbe how deeply touched he was by seeing the face of the Reb Marash, and how the Reb Marash had given him a personal audience with his father. And the Reb Marash had so told him, you should always remember that you are a Jew, and be careful with the friends you're hanging out with, because it's hazardous, the people you're hanging out with. He was very touched by what the Rebbe had said, and that had a marked effect on him for a long time. He came back to Petersburg. He disassociated with his friends, and they were surprised. He didn't join them for the non-Jewish holidays, and he just kept to himself, and he was doing pretty well. But he still was in high school, and when his family went away to the summer home, the end of that following year, because of his associates in high school, some of them were more intellectual, some of them were more lustful, whatever it was, but they all together had an effect on him, and he slowly but surely left the values again of his. I like the story because it's not just he leaves and he comes back. There's a cycle of leaving and coming back and challenges. It's very intricate, and you see the whole complexity of the human spirit and the challenges of an neshama. Anyways, that summer, he writes, the previous Rebbe says in detail exactly what happened to him. The previous Rebbe said that there was one party, and party ended late. He comes home, and he missed Ma'ariv. Another time, his friends were going swimming, and because his friends were going swimming, he missed Shachris. Another time, he told the previous Rebbe he ate with his friends. Obviously, he ate non-kosher, and he felt very distant from where he was before. And when his father invited him once again to join him to go to Lubavitch for Rosh Hashanah, he didn't want to go. Instead, he went to a local synagogue, but he remembers telling the Frierdiker Rebbe, he tells, I remember sitting there in shul and feeling how this is all foreign to me. The shul, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. He attended the synagogue, he's Jewish, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, but he felt how strange it was to him. So his father invited him to come. He didn't come with his father. And again, he's with his non-Jewish friends. He's with them at their parties. And he needed money to support his new lifestyle. And he asked his mother for money. He asked his father's cashiers for money a few times. One day, his father, Reb Leib, called him over. Previous Rebbe doesn't say this in the story, but you could see there's a tension. I mean, there's obvious tension between him and his father. And his father says to him, I can give you all the money that you would like, but I want you to separate from these friends that you're hanging around with. They aren't good for you. And he tells his father, I don't need you and your money. And to prove his point, he left his father's house and got his own apartment, and he totally disconnected with his family. 6 years pass. In these 6 years, he gets married, and he lives to a Jewish woman, living a totally secular lifestyle. And he joins this group called the Young Progressives. The Young Progressives were interested in doing various humanitarian things. It wasn't a Jewish group, but they did have a Jewish sector within their organization to help the Jewish people. And at that time, there were various things Jewish people were acutely suffering from. One of them was pogroms. Various times, the government itself would tell the governors of various regions in Russia to incite pogroms. And because of his, he had a friend who told him that the Rebbe Maharash was visiting Petersburg, and he wanted to see him, and especially because he knew that the Rebbe Maharash was very influential in government circles, so he wanted to hear more about the Rebbe Maharash's involvement, and that's when he ended up visiting the hotel Pavlovsky on Zabalovsky Street, something like that, in Petersburg. And he comes to the hotel. At the hotel, there's throngs of chassidim there. Some of them recognized him, and he describes how chassidim are so special with their love. He didn't look at all like them anymore, and yet they greeted him as if nothing happened. He says that he and his friends would talk about how chassidim have it right when it comes to love. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, doesn't matter your lifestyle. And he remembers the warm feelings of all of everyone's talking to him and welcoming him. He remembers two individuals in particular who had come to his apartment shortly after he had left his father's house and tried to convince him to go back to his father's home. And he saw those chassidim there, and they greeted him, and they hugged him, and they welcomed him. He felt so good being back in this environment. As he is there at the hotel, he suddenly hears the voice of everyone together in unison screaming out, Baruch Hashem Vayrach Lo'ilam V'ed. The beginning of Ma'ariv, the evening prayers had begun. It was it was December in 1881, and it was Chavdala Tevis. It was the 24th day of Tevis, and the anniversary of the passing of the Alter Rebbe. And the Rebbe Maharash had come out at the end of the minyan to say Kaddish for the Alter Rebbe. And he remembers how touched he was hearing the voice and seeing the face once again of the Rebbe Maharash. Shortly afterwards, on January 4th in 1882, he and his friends, he and one of his associates from this organization, Young Progressives, wanted to have an audience with the Rebbe Maharash to discuss information that they had about upcoming pogroms that the Ministry of the Internal Affairs in Russia was instigating. And the Rabbi Maharash was there trying to stop these pogroms, and they wanted to share with the Rabbi Maharash what they knew about what was going on, but they didn't really know, they didn't want to tell this to the attendants. This was top secret information, and they wanted to share this directly with the Rabbi Maharash, but they didn't really know how to get an audience. So they visited the hotel, he and one of his associates in the Young Progressives, and they didn't look at all of the part, of course, of the people there. They're not religious at all. And he tries to get information about how to see the Rebbe Maharash, and he finds out that every morning the Rebbe Maharash would take a walk at 9:30 a.m. So he goes with his friend back to the hotel the next morning, hoping to see the Rebbe Maharash. 9:30 a.m. comes, but the Rebbe does not come out. They were hoping to hand the Rebbe a note, and maybe the Rebbe Maharash would consider seeing them, but the Rebbe Maharash is not going to walk that day. Why not? Because at 11 a.m., he's going to meet with two officials from the Interior Ministry. And he wanted to, Mr. YM and his companion wanted to speak to the Marash, especially because they had information that was pertinent to the meeting. So they didn't really know what to do, and they're standing there, and as they're standing there outside the room of the Rebbe Marash comes out, accompanied with another chassid. The Friedrich Rebbe, again, doesn't describe who even this chassid is. He calls him Mr. Rebbe N.H. Rebbe N.H. accompanies the Rebbe Marash out of the room, and they're pacing back and forth the hallway of the hotel. As they're pacing back and forth, the Rebbe Marash notices him and his friend. He calls him over, and he says to him, "Do you remember the mimer that you heard 8 years ago? Do you still remember that mimer?" Apparently, when he was there for Rosh Hashanah, the Rebbe Marash had said a mimer, and the Rebbe Marash was asking him, "Do you remember what I shared then? Do you remember the Hasidic discourse that you heard in Lubavitch 8 years ago?" He is totally shocked. All he could say back to the Rebbe is, "It is very important information, and it's urgent that he speak to the Rebbe." The Rebbe Marash told the Chassid Rebbe N.H. to invite them to come with him, and they came into the Rebbe Marash's room. And at that point, Mr. Y.M. tells the previous Rebbe, "I and my companion became the aides of the previous Rebbe, of the Rebbe Marash, working hand in hand with him to try to alleviate the difficult conditions of the Jewish people in Russia, both the financial difficulties and the pogroms. And we worked hand in hand intimately with him to stop all of these pogroms." And it's a long, long story. I just want to share with you one, perhaps two more points of the story. The Rebbe Marash told this Mr. Y.M. when he came into his room, he said to him that, "When was the last time you put on tefillin?" The Rebbe Marash said to him, "You don't have to tell me anything." He said, "I could tell you where and when you did everything." And the Rebbe Marash begins to recount to him various incidents that happened in his life, details of things that happened in his life that began his spiritual drifting away from Judaism. The Rebbe Marash is describing this to him in detail, and it's a long, long story. There's one more point I want to share with you. At another occasion, he's in the Rebbe Marash's room, and again discussing communal matters. And he had various challenges going back and forth with his Yiddishkeit. After that previous encounter with the Rebbe Marash, he sure enough put on tefillin for a whole entire year, very carefully. He was very touched. He bought tefillin the very next day, and it did affect him. But other things happened, and he again drifted away from Yiddishkeit eventually. But at one occasion, he's in the Rebbe Marash's room, and he had a very serious question because they had heard word, him, the young progressives in this organization, about an imminent threat, a very grave threat to the Jewish people. And the Rebbe Marash said to him that the threat that you're talking about isn't as grave as you think. I was today by my father-in-law's gravesite, the Tzemach Tzedek, who had passed away 16 years before. And although 16 years had passed, the Rebbe Marash said, "I told my father what happened, and my father says the following should be done." And he begins to say in detail what should be done. He even gave him various letters. He wrote letters to this professor and a letter to another influential person, and he asked Mr. Y.M. to edit those letters, make sure the grammar in the letters was appropriate. And this is what the Rebbe Marash said to him. He said, when Moshe Rabbeinu was told by God to make the second tablets, the Torah says God told Moses that the leftovers you can keep. And Moses, in his tent, God produced miraculously this very precious stone from which Moses made the tablets. And from the leftover of that stone, leftover stones in his tent, the quarry that suddenly appeared in his tent, Moses became very, very wealthy. So Rebbe Marash said to this Mr. Y.M. that when you work for the community, you do things for the Jewish people, there's a blessing there. And you're going to become wealthy, you're going to have a good life. And he said to him, how long can it last? 50 years or 55 years? Hot blood and lust eventually cools down. Eventually it stops. 50 years, 55 years. Remember who you are and don't forget how you grew up. That's what the Ramash said to him. This whole story, the Frierdiker Rebbe is listening to. It took him about 3 hours for Mr. YM to say this story to the previous Rebbe. And the previous Rebbe, he told the previous Rebbe that he just turned 55. And the previous Rebbe says how, oh, here was the punchline I forgot to say. The Ramash said to him, it says in the Torah, as I shared before, when you throw a staff in the air, it falls on its roots. So the Ramash told this chassid, he told Mr. YM, whenever you get thrown in the air, you always end up going back to your roots. It may last till 50, till 55 years, but eventually hot blood and lust have a limit. And now, when he met the previous Rebbe, he had just turned 55, and he describes the previous Rebbe what happened in his life, how his wife had died, and how he again left Yiddishkeit. But now, of course, this was a changing moment for him in his life. And although he was thrown in the air, but when you're thrown in the air, you always fall on your roots. Same as with each of us. We may be thrown in the air in different ways. We're in different, very pivotal moment in history. And in this pivotal moment, we gravitate naturally. We have to understand ourselves. It's natural to gravitate to your roots when you get thrown in the air. And it's really a fortunate time in history to do things that need to get done for the sake of Jews and Judaism and the world. Because as my Rambam says, one good thought, one good word, one good action could tip the scale. And it could be the very next one, the very next good thought that you think could tip the scale and bring Mashiach for the entire world. So we just need to let ourselves go to where we want to go. We feel attracted to our roots because we got thrown in the air. It's not hypocritical. It's who we are the whole time inside. So let's go there and let God blow the shofar ready. Let us all return to where we really want to go. We want to go home to be with Mashiach, to be with Hashem in Yerushalayim, in the Har HaChodesh, in the Holy Mountain in Jerusalem. The rebuilding of the Bais Bezalel may happen tonight. L'chaim, l'chaim, l'bracha. Let's say l'chaim for all those in the for Shlema. Let's have in mind everyone who, wherever we are, we're connected. Let's say l'chaim together. The very great power who's wishing each other well. Chassidic farbrengen can accomplish. Malach Machol cannot accomplish. Let's say l'chaim for Rapinya Korf. Rafal Pinchas ben Marasar Rivka and Gesund und Stark. Yonatan Ariel ben Chana. David ben Shoshana. Avram Aaron ben Yenta. Afua Kreva Shlema. L'chaim, l'chaim, Mashiach now. L'chaim and bracha. L'chaim, a good davach. Questions, comments, criticism, tomatoes, cucumbers. A good davach, everyone.
Good luck. Thank you.